Hello there. Hi, my name is Jonathan Pape, and I am part of the Dedham School of Music. And on behalf of all of us, I want to welcome you to our Sharing Music series. Over the course of the next 30 minutes and all the episodes that follow, we're going to introduce you to people who have chosen to make music a part of their lives. Some folks who are involved may live down the street from you, while others may be introduced to you for the first time, but they have all made a place for music in their lives. We cannot wait for you to hear their stories about the instruments they love, the art they pursue, and the artists they've kept close to their hearts. We hope that when each of our episodes is over, you'll think a little differently about a style of music that never interested you before. Listen to that playlist a little bit longer, and maybe, just maybe, you'll pick up that instrument you've always wondered about. Tonight, we're going to introduce you to Sam Gilman and Brian Thomas, and we're excited to let them tell their stories together. So, welcome, gentlemen. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Johnny, and thanks so much to the Dedham School of Music for having us. And what a honor it is to be part of the debut episode of this series, and especially because Sam and I both live in Dedham. It kind of makes it extra special to be here. So thanks a lot to everyone at Dedham School of Music and to Johnny for inviting us. So essentially, what we're going to talk about and share with you a little bit is. Excuse me. We're going to talk about soul jazz, and really, that is such a huge term because it's really instrumental, funk, modern jazz that we play and the scene that we play with in Boston. But in order to do that, we want to give you a little context because jazz is such a huge genre, and the umbrella that is jazz has so many things that fall into that category. That would sound completely different, but yet we still really categorize it all in that same big genre. And then there's the subgenres underneath to help organize it a little bit more. So jazz is really born at the turn of the century, early 1900s, and developing, and it's really the popular music for that first chunk of the century. It's dance music, it's pop music, it's party music. That's where everything's happening. And then all of a sudden things started to change a little bit, and rock and roll kind of came in the 50s, and Elvis Presley is a thing. And jazz kind of started to split into a lot of different directions in terms of what was going to happen. Some in some cases it was still trying to maintain that social aspect of jazz and dancing, and then other musicians decided to kind of go into a different direction, and it became more art music. So we're gonna jump ahead, and we're really gonna start in the 1960s to talk about our influences a little bit, and then we'll talk about what we do and why we do it, and our journeys and our paths. So you had this split in jazz, and a lot of different things were happening. You had Latin jazz, you have avant-garde jazz, you have your straight ahead jazz, you have your singers, all kinds of different things, but it was all really different. So a lot of times when we think of jazz and we think of the 60s, and we think of going to clubs like the Village Vanguard in the New York City and the Manhattan scene, you might think of something like Coltrane or Annette Coleman. We got this little clip to show you. This is Eric Dolphy. I just give you a little taste of this. This is Eric Dolphy, who's a reed player, and Charles Mingus, who is a bass player. So this is one thing that was happening in jazz. I'm just going to give you a little taste of it. Okay, cool. I'll stop right there. So if, you know killing, first of all, amazing, incredible. But if your palate hasn't been developed to the point where you can really process that sound, it's not really dance music. It's not, super familiar harmonically. So for a lot of folks, it really became art music and listening music. And you would sit at a jazz club or a concert hall and you would, be relatively quiet, listening to it, and less of a social vibe. Another pathway that folks went was more towards the soulful side, and that's really what we're gonna is going to be our jumping off point. And so a lot of these musicians, they first of all, they wanted to play to for their own people, right? So if you're going to the Village Vanguard to see Eric Dolphy, it probably was not a huge African American population in that club watching that. It probably was just a different thing. Whereas the soul jazz down maybe wasn't happening in Manhattan. It might have been happening in Newark or New Jersey, and then obviously in Philadelphia, but then in Buffalo and Cleveland and Chicago, Detroit, and it just a different kind of scene. So imagine this now. I'm going to share you another clip. This is this is Jack McDuff, who is one of the organ players that we're going to talk about here today. And this is the same year, but a completely different direction. Ooh, okay, I'll stop there for a second. So now, hopefully, you're hearing that is a lot different than what we just heard with Eric Dolphy, right? There's more of a groove. It's still swing and it's still jazz, but there's more head bobbing. You could hear that backbeat. You could hear the cross stick happening with the drummer, and that familiar sound of the organ. If you've grown up in the church, and really, really quite different directions. Probably the organist that really kind of pushed us in that direction heavily was a guy by the name of Jimmy Smith, and he could play with the beboppers and he could play all that fast crazy jazz, but then he also started adding more components of gospel music, of blues, and then ultimately of funky on the funky side. And that is really what we're going to be talking about. So I'll pass it off to Sam to talk about Jimmy Smith and maybe talk about the organ specifically a little bit.
Thanks, BT. Yeah, so Jimmy Smith was, the innovator in a lot of ways. He brought the Hammond organ into the forefront of jazz music. And you got to understand that the Hammond organ was primarily a church instrument at the time. And then a lot of the clubs that a lot of these guys were playing, a lot of the standard jazz clubs like the Blue Note or the Village Vanguard, they might have house pianos, but a lot of these other clubs on the Chitlin circuit, which is what it's called, probably had Hammond organs in the club. And so Jimmy Smith was able to take the jazz language of the bebop and be able to play like Charlie Parker or Miles Davis, and then bring in the soulful influence of gospel music and Motown, which was also happening at the time. Now, specifically, the Hammond organ works very well in this setting of soul jazz because you can do a lot with it. And I'm just going to take a second to just go over the instrument because I've got a Hammond organ right here. This is a Hammond A100. There's the A100, the B3, the C3. They're all in the same family. They're all basically the same. They all just have different cases. And I'm just going to do a really quick run over of what this instrument is and what it does. You've got two different keyboards here. So this allows you to have lots of different sounds. You've got these black and white things up here, which you can kind of see in the zoom. These are called the drawbars. Now, this instrument was made to replicate a pipe organ. And so each one of these drawbars is made to replicate a different size pipe. So on a pipe organ, you would have small little pipes for the small high harmonic sounds, and then these huge giant pipes for the low harmonic sound. So these drawbars were meant to replicate that. Inside of this instrument is actually a large metal kind of what is called a tone wheel generator. and it basically has these little pieces of metal that are spinning and that are hooked up to a pickup, and each one is notched slightly differently, and that pickup, as it spins, the pickup picks up the sound and it generates a different kind of sound, whether high or low. And so you can see if I'm playing a single note on my organ here, you got a little note there, and then as I pull out my drawbars, it builds up more and more. And this was able to replicate the kind of the church, the pipe organ sound. Now, when Jimmy Smith took the organ, now keep in mind, please, that the Hammond organ was being used in jazz before Jimmy Smith, while Bill and Fats Waller were also using the Hammond organ, but very differently. Jimmy Smith was the first one to really use it in a jazz setting. And what set him apart was that he started playing left-hand bass line. So all of a sudden, he took the bass player out of the equation, and he was playing left-hand bass like this. And all of a sudden, you didn't need a bass player anymore. And also with the organ, because it's such a big sound, all of a sudden you can go. So you can have this very large, big band sound with just an organ and a drummer and maybe a guitar player. So all of a sudden, something you needed, maybe 10 musicians to do, all of a sudden now you could do it with a much smaller group. Now, the other key component is, and I don't know if we can pull this up, the Leslie cam. Now, this is another part. The Hammond organ is very important, but the other important part is the speaker that the Hammond organ goes through, which is called a Leslie speaker. Now, that's a Leslie speaker. It's a certain model called a 142. And this is a rotating speaker cabinet. And I get this asked all the time when I'm playing out, well, what is that thing? Why is it spinning? This was meant to replicate the sound of a pipe organ. Now, when you're sitting in a pipe, in a church, the pipes of the organ are literally surrounding you. They're, from the front of the church, maybe to halfway through. So that sound is resonating all around you. So the Leslie speaker was kind of meant to do that. So you can see it's got two, it's kind of hard to see on the bottom, but it's got two moving parts. It's got the top horn and the bottom, and they're running opposite of each other like this, which kind of creates a Doppler kind of sound. Now, what's cool about the Leslie is I can control the speed of it. So I can go slow, and then I can speed it up and go fast. And that really brought it all of a sudden the whole new world to the music and to the jazz scene, because all of a sudden, you can have a band of maybe 3-4 people, and you can replicate a sound of a big band because you've got the organ. You don't need a bass player anymore. You've got an amplified keyboard that can be fairly loud, so you can play more raucous clubs with more dance style music, and you don't need as much, as many instruments to cover the sound. So it was really innovative in a lot of ways. And Jimmy Smith was the forefront of that. And then we saw Jack McDuff was another great organ player kind of earlier, and he followed that up. And there's a long line of these instruments. And all these guys came through with kind of soul and blues music. And I think we've got a little clip of Jimmy Smith. Can we pull up the Jimmy Smith video? We're going to show just a little clip of Jimmy Smith playing. I think this is the sermon. Great. That's perfect. And then also what you saw right there is there's foot pedals, which is much like a church organ. There's foot pedals, and he is actually playing. Sometimes he's playing bass with his feet, which then opens up his left hand to play more chords. So the organ really, you could do so much with it, and it was driven so much by the gospel and the soul and the blues music, which really brought all those styles into jazz So Jimmy Smith was able to take the bebop and the hard bop and the straight ahead jazz and blend it with this soul and gospel and blues influence. And that's really what created soul jazz. And then as we move forward, it kind of created a different thing. So I'm going to throw it off to Brian now, and we're going to talk about what happened after this invention of, or this creation of this new kind of music.
Great, thanks, Sam. So yeah, and just one more thing about that whole scene and that whole circuit, and that this became a thing, and there was organs in all the clubs too. So it was a whole circuit, and these organ players would go around and they'd play the same clubs, and they'd circulate, and they'd play to a black audience. And then I think that's like one of the things that we have to remember is that they were aiming for and purposefully catering to a different audience than maybe the standard Newport Jazz Festival audience that you might think. So I think that's pretty crucial. So jumping ahead, all these other jazz musicians that had come up through playing jazz, all of a sudden they wanted a piece of that too, right? And then all of a sudden now it's not just Motown and Stax, it's James Brown, it's Sly and the Family Stone, it's straight up funk bands that are the popular thing. And again, jazz musicians wanted to find a way to play to that audience. So they started craving that. So Herbie Hancock, who is a pianist and cut his teeth as a kid with Miles Davis, and then really played an amazing jazz. He was a virtuoso classical pianist as well as a child, but he wanted something different, and so he took that jazz background, combined it with the soul jazz and the organ sounds that had already been brewing with some more keyboards that are not the conventional piano, and he came up with a sound like this. I'll stop right there for the sake of time. So that's the song Chameleon, which became a pop hit, right? It was a huge hit. And you can see him playing the clavinet, and he would have a Rhodes or Worley, all kinds of keyboards that weren't the conventional piano. Kind of a really cool direction that the music went in. I'm going to kind of jump ahead now to us and why we're here, because we spent about half the time giving you a little foundation, and when Johnny had invited Sam and I to be a part of this, I think he wanted us to talk about why we do what we do, and a little bit about our background. So I'm a smidge older than Sam, but we came up around the same time, and in the 90s, when I started playing in bands, there was a big jam band scene. So a jam band scene, was basically like the Fish Heads, the Grateful Dead crew, all this audience that was craving improvisational music. And they wanted an experience at a show that wasn't just a band running down a set list. So when I started coming up through, it was cool to improvise. It was cool to stretch out. It was cool for you to play a 60-minute set and only be 2 songs. It was, that was what we were doing. And that's what a lot of these groups did too. They'd stretch them out and they would really explore a little bit. And that new opportunity kind of, or that new audience kind of gave new life to instrumental jazz and funk. And not that there wasn't stuff going on before that. We didn't talk about like David Sanborn and like, a lot of other things in the 80s that were happening, but this new awakening really gave opportunity for some of the musicians that were originally doing it. Someone like Melvin Sparks, who was a guitar player that was on all these albums in the 60s and 70s. He had a resurgence when he connected with the jam band scene. Maceo Parker from the James Brown band. All these old school guys started coming back around. The Meters, George Porter, huge in the jam band scene now, and they really cut their teeth playing funk and soul jazz. And then there was one band in particular that I think really took everybody by storm, and that was a band called Soul Live. They were brother combo. They still exist. A brother combo out of Buffalo, and they linked up with guitar player, and they really dialed in that organ trio sound. But all of a sudden, they were in their 20s at the time, so they were influenced by hip hop. They were listening to rap, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, all that kind of stuff, combination with jazz, combination with everything else. And really that kind of opened the door for all these other bands to be like, okay, this is cool to do this. And it became a scene. For me personally, I grew up in Rochester, New York, and then I went to college in Ithaca, and I moved to Boston. And the only thing I knew to do was go to Wally's Cafe. So if you've ever heard of Wally's, Wally's on Mass Ave in the South End, and it really is the center of jazz in Boston right now. It's the longest standing club, and it's just an amazing historical place. Well, that's where we would go every single night, and we'd play this music, and we'd experiment, and we'd get to jam together, and you'd network, and you'd build friendships, and you'd build common repertoire. And Wally's was and still is, when we're not in a pandemic, the the spot. So that's the first thing that I want everyone to do that's listening to this right now, is make sure you put Wally's on your list to do the very moment things are open up, and we have the opportunity to get back out and about. Wally's is the spot for sure. And kind of build from there. And we have a really great crew of musicians in Boston and in New England, the greater Northeast, that we collaborate with. And it's really great. I met Sam along the way, honestly, because one of the things that we do, because we all have this common repertoire and we all have these common influences, we do a lot of pickup gigs. And by a pickup gig, I mean, it's not like an official band. A lot of that for me happens at the Beehive, which is another club in the South End. And, I'll have a Friday night date there, and I'll say, okay, I need to get a band together. Who's available? And a couple of the organ players that I had normally used weren't available that night. So somebody gave me Sam's number. And so Sam put Sam on the gig, and the next thing you know, we've been playing together, ever since. So it's kind of the nice thing, and it's the shared repertoire, the shared language that we all speak, and we're all able to play together, which is really cool.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's one of the great things about soul jazz is that it connected me to our community. And it exists in a world that is rare for musicians these days, because particularly with jazz music, all the songs in jazz, which we call jazz standards, they're all written out. You can go on the internet, you can buy what's called a real book, and all this music is written out. But with soul jazz, most of that music is not written. It's an oral tradition. And oral, I mean oral, like you listening. And a lot of times I'm learning the stuff on the gig. And I'll be saying, Brian will call a song, and I'll say, I don't know this song. And he'll be like, it's easy. This is how it goes. And he'll just tell me real quick, and you just throw to the fire and you start playing. And by the second or third time through, you kind of picked it up and you know the song now. That's a tradition that was what used to happen when jazz was starting with all these guys. So there's no music, there's no real books, there's no internet, right? And it was an oral tradition, and guys would learn this music through listening to recordings or going to clubs and listening to guys play. So it's fascinating to me that we are carrying on this tradition and with this kind of music, and we have a large repertoire of music, of songs that you can only learn by listening to them and playing. And we always, you find some old record and you pull another song out of the void, and now it's added to the repertoire and we're playing it again. And I started out when I lived in Chicago, and that's where I grew up, and I got into Jimmy Smith and organ and soul jazz, and I was really into Fish, which opened me up to Soul Live, because Blue Note Records in the late 90s started promoting the modern kind of jazz, soul jazz guys, which Soul Live was one of them, and Medeski and Martin Wood was on that. And so I kind of got in through that. And then when I moved to Boston, which was kind of the epicenter of a lot of the stuff was happening in Boston and New York at the time, I started my own organ group called Otis Grove. And we very much kept that tradition of soul jazz going. And then we actually were playing a residency every Saturday night at the Middle East in Cambridge. And so we kind of started playing more rock and roll mixed with soul jazz to kind of cater to that audience a little bit more and kind of develop our own sound. But that's when I hooked up with Brian doing these pickup gigs and his band Akashic Record at the time. And we kind of all blended together. And there's another group called the B3 Kings, which also plays this kind of style of music. And it became a collective. It became a music collective of musicians who all share the same repertoire that was just there in the ether, and then we all kind of pulled from. And it was a very special, and it still is. It's a very special thing, and I feel very fortunate to be part of this community.
It's kind of cool when you get called to like play one of these kind of gigs, like, you know, you don't even really worry about what the set list is going to be because, you know, all right, well, when I get there, somebody will tell us what tunes we're playing. Like if someone's really on top of it, maybe they send out a Spotify list or something. Yeah. But like, generally speaking, you know, you work on that shared repertoire, or you just really use your ears and you'll make sure you know that tune the next time, you know, around as well. You know, but it's fun. It really is a collective. You know, I'd say it's probably like a group of like 40, 50 of us that kind of play this kind of music within the scene in the area. And you know, you don't know, sometimes you don't even know who else is going to be on the gig. You know, I lead a lot of them, so I know. My wife will ask, "Oh, who's on it this time? Well, who's playing this week?" You know, and it's cool. And then also because of this, we've gotten to learn each other's original music as well. You know, it's kind of, you know, we use that common repertoire as a foundation, but then we also are able to sprinkle in our own compositions that are influenced by obviously that same scene and that work in the setting as well. So that's one of my favorite things to do is to you know, either bring new material of my own to a group or to help somebody else support their new material that they're working on. Because, you know, that's the other way that we're going to keep this music alive and keep it going is by continuing to write it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I had the privilege of doing some recording with Melvin Sparks, who passed away a couple years ago, but this was about 15 years ago. When I was really just starting out and very young, and Otis Grove was just kind of getting off the ground, and and Melvin Sparks was a guitar player who is on some of the most influential records that I have, you know, was listening to at the time. And for me, it was a huge deal because he was, you know, the grandfather of this kind of music and playing with all the people who I really looked up to. And it was an honor to be able to play with him and then have him playing on my own compositions that were influenced by this music, in a way of like kind of bridging that gap between the two. And so it was really, you know, it's fun for me to be able to like continue this tradition on and be able to play with some of the masters. And I know Brian's had a lot of experience playing with some of the greats of that style.
Yeah, every so often, you know, I have to pinch myself when I'm on one of those gigs with one of those masters. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, I had the opportunity to play a handful of gigs with Maceo Parker, who's, you know, the saxophonist that you hear on all those James Brown records and all the Parliament records and Prince before Prince passed away. I mean, Maceo's the guy, and you know, you're just like, wow. Remember doing one gig with him, and he was just like ironing his pants before the gig, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's Maceo ironing his pants. You know, you get a little starstruck because you listen to these albums and you know they're you know, they're so amazing, and then when you get a chance to play with some of them, it's really special experience for sure.
Yeah.
Hey guys, can I jump in and ask you a couple questions?
Absolutely.
For sure.
So, and BT, you want to start with this one? Who's responsible for getting you started at an early age, or when you first picked up your instrument?
Well, you know, I mean, my father, you know, was a music lover. You know, he always, you know, he's such a musician inside, and you know, he's constantly at concerts and just like he's in the scene, and everyone asks him, well, what instrument do you play? And he's like, oh, I play the stereo. You know, he didn't really play anything, but he always had it on in the house, you know, whether that was a lot of classical music, but it was also a lot of this in particular, organ jazz. You know, he probably has every organ trio record that's ever been recorded, you know, like a wall of CDs and vinyl and stuff. And so probably, you know, my exposure to this kind of music comes from him. But I was really lucky growing up in Rochester, New York, that both of my regular band directors were Eastman grads, just like, you know, like a lot of other people in Rochester, and having that training also just means they're just super killing musicians, and they just happen to stay in Rochester because they got a teaching gig or whatever. So Roger Eckers was one of my teachers. He was a saxophone player, or is a saxophone player, and he, you know, he was always working too, playing gigs on the side. So that's what I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. He's playing. And then my other teacher was a guy by the name of Rich Thompson, who's now he teaches drums at Eastman now, but at the time he was teaching high school band with me. And, you know, I got to see him play with Dizzy Gillespie. I got to see him play with Count Basie Orchestra. I got to see him play, you know, in so many amazing settings. So as a high school, you know, I saw this pathway of being able to, you know, perform live, you know. So I was lucky as a teenager and before, for sure.
You got some real-time examples along with some actual lessons in the classroom, sort of.
For sure, yeah. Our band program wasn't like a marching band program, you know. It was,
Yeah,
you know, it was we were trying to play.
I hear that. I gotcha. And what about you, Sam?
Well, for me, it started actually. My brother's a musician, and my mom's a musician, and my brother was playing saxophone. And actually, my early part of my life, I was living in Ithaca, New York, and my brother had a band, and the piano player in the band was this guy named Adam Benjamin, who is now a very famous jazz piano player in a band called Kneebody. But at the time, he was just this scrawny high school kid, but he was a virtuoso. And I was a very young kid watching him play and just kind of being blown away by what he could do on the piano, and kind of really taken aback. And so that kind of what set me on the path. And then when I moved to Chicago, all of a sudden I had this outlet to go see all this amazing music. And I studied with a piano teacher named Peter Shiner, who is the piano player for Junior Wells, who's a great blues harmonica player. And Chicago is obviously a really heavy blues town, so that was really a huge influence. But I was able to go. I mean, I don't know how I was able to go, but I was able to get into a lot of clubs back in the mid '90s when I was underage, just by walking in the door. And so I was able to see a lot of amazing jazz musicians just because they all would come through Chicago, because it's Chicago. And so I would go see Pharoah Sanders and McCoy Tyner and John Schofield and Von Freeman, who was a local guy, Kurt Elling, Daniel Perez. I mean, the list goes on and on. I would just go see, and it was just like absorbing all this amazing music all the time in the city, and I just feel thankful for that. And then once I moved to Boston, you know, that's when I really got. I was playing a little bit of Hammond organ when I was in high school because my music teacher got one like the last year I was there. And I remember I got in trouble because I would always sneak into his room during like between classes and play, and he'd like yell at me, be like, "You're not supposed to be in here." And I'm like, just trying to play the organ, you know, like, come on. And then when I moved to Boston to go to Berkeley, you know, they had Hammond organ classes, and they had a Hammond organ, and then it was all over from there for me. And I just became obsessed with the instrument and the music, and and then I got to study with Dave Lamina and Bruce Katz, who are two great local Hammond organ players. Bruce was in Greg Allman's band for a long time. And then Dave is now the chair of the piano department at Berkeley, who also plays with a lot of great people around. So that's kind of what set me on my path. And then from there, you know, I feel like my teachers are now like Brian and all the other guys I get to play with all the time. Like, I learned so much from just playing with other musicians now. They push me, you know, they make me, I gotta get better by playing with them. You know, they make me raise my own level. They make me want to practice. They make me want to learn. So that's one of the things that I will always be thankful for from the music scene, because it makes me want to be a better musician always.
That's awesome.
That's definitely, you know, true. Like with the scene, as we all push each other, and And I lead a lot of these bands, and I'm the in charge of the gigs, whatever. I guess that just means I get the 1099 at the end of the year, the W-2. But a lot of times when I'm picking the musicians, I kind of think back to I remember some silly basketball video that I watched when I went to basketball camp as a little kid, and it said, you want to always make sure that whoever you're playing basketball with, you're the worst one on the court, because you're going to get better if you're playing with some people that are really killing. So as a band leader, I'm always like, okay, who can I get on this gig that's really going to push me, And as a trombone player, it's not like a notey instrument, So a lot of times, like these sax players, I'm like, okay, I'm going to get Mike Tucker or Tucker Antel, these heavyweight dudes, and it really pushes you to be better, because oh, they just took that solo, so I gotta come up with something myself now, and but it's at the same time, it's not like competitive. I feel like it's very nurturing. Like everybody is supportive of each other in this scene, which is cool. Yeah. It's not always like that, and I had some experiences back in the day where it wasn't so nurturing. But I would say right now, the musicians that we all play with and that we collaborate with, it's a lot of mutual respect and a positive environment.
Well, guys, I want to say thanks for donating your time and your thoughts on this, and sharing your skill, your interest, your love, and your passion. So on behalf of everybody at the school, thanks for doing this. I hope you've enjoyed it. And to the folks watching at home, if you've enjoyed our program and you're interested in taking a lesson or a class with the school, our contact information is on our website. It's on our Facebook page. Our website is the Dedham School of Music.org. It has all our classes. We can't wait to meet you. And if you're interested in supporting our school and programming like this, we've done our best to make that as easy as possible. There's a donate button at the top of our page. Thank you to BT, to Sam, to John, who's helping me out behind the scenes, and everybody watching. We're grateful for your support. And I want to say thank you all for tuning in tonight. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Also, one thing I want to add, that we have a Spotify playlist with a lot of this music that we've been talking about today that we're going to be posting on the Facebook, the Dedham School Music Facebook page. So please check it out.
Thanks for the reminder, and thanks to you guys again, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. I'm going to sign off the live stream. Thank you very much.
Thanks.